What's up everyone, and welcome back to another episode. So today I'm going to be showing you how I built this beast of a bed. From the solid white oak bed frame to the slatted headboard with the floating drawers and the wireless chargers and much more. And I've got to admit, this is the coolest and the best thing that I've ever built. So if you want to see how this whole thing come together, then follow along the rest of this video. Yep. So the bed itself is made out of two separate parts, which is the headboard and then the actual bed frame itself. To make a start on this project, we're going to start with the bed frame. So most of the bed is going to be made out of solid white oak. And I got some 6/4 white oak for the actual frame part of the bed, and I got some 4/4 for the slatted headboard and the drawers and stuff like that. As you can see, this stuff is pretty rough, not very flat, and it needs milling up. So why don't we go take it over to the boneyard and make some mess. Okay, so now that all the 6/4, the thicker white oak of the pack has been milled down, so it's got two nice flat faces and a square edge. They were all roughly around about 8.5 inches in width, so I ripped them all down to be 8 inches on my table saw. I then picked my 4 most favorite pieces out of the pack, and this is what's going to assemble the actual bed frame itself. So I got the front, the 2 sides, and the back piece. Fortunately, at this time, I could only get 8.5 inch wide planks, and I wanted my bed to be 10 inches deep, so I'm gonna have to add 2 inches to each one of these planks. Out of the pack of the 6/4, I picked a couple pieces that best color match the 4 pieces that I've picked out for the actual bed frame, and then ripped them down to 2.5 inches on my table saw. Now that all those are cut, all I gotta do now is domino, glue, and clamp each piece together, and then let it dry for about an hour or so. Okay, so once all the pieces had fully dried, and I took them back out of the clamps and then cleaned up any of the glue residue, which is super satisfying. And then put them back through the planer to get them nice and flat and bring them down to 1.25 inches in thickness, which is exactly how thick I want my bed frame to be. Okay, so now that I got my front, my back, and my left and right rails of the bed frame milled up, it's now time to cut them to length. And I want to cut them to length to accommodate a king size mattress, which is 80 inches by 76. And I also want to allow 1/2 inch all the way around for like the mattress to kind of bulge out a little bit if it wants to, and tuck in some duvet. So I'm going to make sure that the inside of my bed frame is 81 by 77. So all I got to do is measure them up and then cut them on my miter saw. Okay, so now that all my pieces are cut to length, I also went ahead and added 3 dominoes in each corner. This is going to help with alignment and strength of each corner, but it's not going to be the only thing that holds the corner together. I have another extra thing to add in each corner, but we'll get into that in a little bit. For now, the dominoes will hold the frame together so that I can dry assemble it here in the shop, check my measurements, and make sure everything is looking correct. So now I can see how the frame looks, and I like how it looks, and my measurements add up to what I want them to be. So they're gonna perfectly fit a king size mattress in that with a bit of wiggle room. And it looks good. It's massive, but it looks good. So for now, I'm gonna put the front and the back aside and do some work to the left and right hand side rails. So with the left and the right side pieces, I need to attach some material on there to pick up the slats that span the two, which holds up the mattress. So on my table saw, I cut a piece of material out of the 1.25 inch leftover at 1.5 inches wide. So to attach these pieces to the side rails, I could just make it easy on myself and just glue it and screw it, but I kind of want to use the minimum amount of screws as I possibly can in this build. So I'm thinking, again, I'm just going to domino it and glue it, and that's going to be plenty strong enough. So I made a series of marks at 2 inches up from the bottom. And then with my piece, I'm gonna clamp it to those 2 inch marks with the 2 faces that I want glued together perpendicular from each other. So now that the piece is clamped to the 2 inch line, I made a series of marks going down the run where I wanna add the dominoes. And now in theory, the wood itself should be my guide for the domino cutter. So if I've done this right, and I've cut the holes, cut the dominoes correctly, and it should all go in on the 2 inch line and lock together nice and tight. So now all I gotta do is remove all my pencil marks and then glue and clamp it together. And then while that's drying, in the meantime, I can make a start on that center beam. Yep. So for the center beam, this is pretty much what I come up with. And it's basically 2 pieces of the 1¼ white oak ripped down to 2¼ inches. And then I dominoed and glued them together to form this T shape. So structurally, it's nice and strong. I was just gonna have it span the distance of the whole bed, and then I thought, well, I might as well add a couple of feet in there. So that's what I did. I cut these 2 blocks on my table saw, and then I basically, again, dominoed them to the underside. Probably not gonna glue this to the beam. I'm probably gonna leave it dry because it doesn't really move, and all the pressure on it is just pushing down on it. So it's not really gonna put it under any strain or anything like that. And when I'm thinking about it, when I'm gonna try and assemble it, it's gonna be kind of awkward to assemble the bed when this centerpiece is much higher than the rest of the bed. So what I'm thinking, I can assemble the bed, put the centerpiece in, and then lift it up and put all the feet on after the fact, which is gonna make it a whole lot easier. So that's pretty much what I did there. Now that that's done, we can make a start on the 4 legs which go on each of the corners, which bring the bed up off the ground. So when I was designing the bed, I came in here and made a few prototypes of a few things on the bed to make sure that I like how they look, because things in real life obviously look a little bit different to what I've drawn on my computer. So one of these legs is one of the things that I made a prototype of, and I actually really like it, so I'm going to use this in the actual build. But I need to make 3 more of them. And they're pretty easy. I basically just cut a bunch of pieces of white oak at 8 inches in height, and then rip them down from 5 inches at the top to 3 inches at the bottom on my miter sled. And then using my router sled on my table saw, I ripped a 45-degree miter on each piece so that I can glue and tape them together and let them sit for about an hour. And then once they've all dried, you'll have like a bunch of legs like this, like 4 of them in fact. So all we can do now is reassemble the bed and then have a look into attaching them to the bed. So each leg gets attached to each corner of the bed frame via 2 threaded inserts. And the reason why I went with threaded inserts is because I want to be able to take the legs off with ease if I want to store the bed or move it or whatever I want to do in the future. And as the top of each leg is resting on the underside of the rail on the bed frame, the threaded inserts really aren't carrying any weight. They're just helping to keep the leg in position, help keep the corner of the frame nice and tight. So now with all that work done, in theory, all of these legs, including these 2 center ones, should all be at the same height. So in theory, once it's flipped back up to its upright position, all of these points should be touching the floor. So now it's starting to look something like a bed. But before we can make a start on the headboard, we need to put in all of the slats. So for the slats themselves, I'm gonna be using 2" by 3/4 poplar. And the reason why I'm using poplar is because 1, it's super cheap, and 2, it's kind of under the mattress so it never gets seen. So there's not really any point in using like the real expensive fancy wood there. So I went with this. So on my table saw, I cut a bunch of these 2" wide spacers, which are 3/4 inch thick, which is the same thickness of the slats. And then using this 2" wide block, which is gonna replicate basically the slats, I'm gonna glue and pin these little spacers at every 2 inches. And then once that's done, I can simply drop the slats into place and then make a start on the hardware. So I'm going to be attaching these L-shaped brackets to the inside of each corner using threaded inserts. That way I can take it apart whenever I want, and once the mattress is in, this is never going to be seen. Okay, so now that the actual bed frame part of this build is pretty much complete, other than the final sand and finish, it's now time to make a start on the headboard. And for the main core of the headboard itself, I'm gonna be using this 3/4 of an inch white oak plywood. And it's just like regular plywood, except the top and the bottom is a real thin veneer of white oak. And you can get them in a bunch of different types of wood, but because we're mostly working with white oak here, I got the white oak one. And the reason why I went with plywood instead of solid white oak is because it basically looks like a big piece of white oak, except it's about half the cost and about half the weight. And that's great, but it's not quite perfect. See, the grain on the plywood is running horizontally, and my slats are gonna be running vertical, so I want the grain to run vertical as well. So to overcome that, I'm gonna have to cut it in half and then rotate the sheets and then join them together so all the grain is running vertically. Not only that, this is only an 8-foot sheet and I need it to be 10 feet wide. So I'm also gonna have to get a second sheet, cut that in half, and then basically glue 3 pieces together. So that's what I'm gonna do. So I cut each sheet dead in half and then selected the best 3 out of the 4 that go together. And then simply marked and cut a bunch of dominoes down each seam. I then made a center line, center of the middle section, and then 5 feet either side of that line, I made a mark and cut off the excess with my track saw. So with all that done, we have a 10 feet wide by 4 feet high sheet of plywood with the grain going in the right direction. And it looks great and I'm happy how it's looking. So my plan is to have 3/4 inch wide slats at every 1/4 of an inch going vertically across the whole span of the headboard. But I don't want them just to be glued and pinned to the surface of the plywood. I want them to be kind of sat inside a groove so they're kind of locked in and they can't kind of move around and swirl and whatever they want to do. Which means I got to router a 3/4 inch wide groove, 1/8 of an inch deep at every 1/4 of an inch, which is a bit of a mouthful and it's kind of a lot to process, but it will make more sense as I'm going along. And as I want everything symmetrical either side, I'm going to be working from my center line, which I marked earlier. So either side of my center line, I marked a 3/8 of an inch mark and then joined them up, which gives me a 3/4 inch wide channel to cut out. So now that the marks are made, I put a 3/4 inch router bit in my palm router, set at 1/8 of an inch in depth. I then measured from the edge of the bit to the edge of the plate on my router, and that distance is where I'm going to set my fence away from the marks. So now in theory, I should be able to run the face of the router against my straight edge and it should cut out that channel perfectly at 1/8 of an inch deep. So let's hope. So that worked out great. I got a perfect 3/4 of an inch wide groove, dead center of my piece. So now we're just gonna repeat that at every 1/4 of an inch, but I don't want to have to keep on moving my clamp each time because it's going to take me forever and there's going to be a lot of discrepancies in that. So I kind of come up with an idea which I'm hoping will work. With the same router, I removed the smaller base plate and screwed on a wider base plate. And this is just a piece of Perspex that I cut a hole in the middle and the 4 holes for the screw holes. I then set the router bit to 1/8 of an inch deep, and then I got a 3/4 inch wide piece of oak. I attached it to the underside of the base plate, 1/4 of an inch away from the router bit. So now in theory, using this guide in the groove that I've already done, I should be able to recreate a second groove 1/4 of an inch away and continue that process until I've done the whole sheet. So let's see how that goes. So with all that routering done and the mess all cleaned up, we have a pretty funky looking headboard. So next I want to flip it over and attach the bracing and the French cleat to help lock it all together. So like I mentioned, the way that I'm attaching the headboard to the wall is by using French cleats. And French cleats are a simple design. It's basically a posh way of saying a piece of plywood cut down the middle on a 45-degree angle. And then one piece gets attached to whatever you want to mount to the wall, i.e. this headboard, and then the other piece gets attached to the wall. And then you basically kind of just hook it on, and then gravity just holds it in position. And it's really effective and it's really simple. So I'm going to be attaching 4 French cleats, 2 flush with the top, and then 2 about 4 or 5 inches away from the bottom. And I'm simply just going to screw through the back of the French cleat into the back of the headboard. But I'm only going to screw the right and the left hand side sections and leave the middle section free for now so that I can work on it, take it apart, take it upstairs, and then I'm just going to screw it together just before I install it. That way I can take it apart again in the future if I want to, and I'm not having to carry this big 10 feet sheet of plywood down my stairs and wherever it may be going. So I just want to future-proof this whole thing. I also added a couple of braces, the thickness of my French cleats all the way around, so I can pick up for when I install the trim around the outside, and just to kind of keep the whole thing flat and secure. And then flip it back over. Now that that's all wrapped up, I now want to make a start on the slats, and the 2 drawers go on either side of the bed. And they're both going to be made out of the same white oak, the same thickness. So I milled a bunch of the 1 inch, the 4/4 white oak down to just over 3/4 of an inch in thickness. So now with all that milled up to just over 3/4 of an inch in thickness, I got the shorter stuff for the slats and then the longer stuff for the carcass of the drawers. I want to be able to get the drawers built before I put the slats in. So for now, I'm going to put this shorter stuff aside and, well, make a start on the drawers. So I want the carcass of my drawers to be about 14 inches in depth. And obviously these aren't 14 inches wide. So I got a domino, glue, and clamp the 2 pieces together. And then once they've dried, I rip them down on my table saw to make 14-inch wide pieces. So now that my pieces are milled up, it's now time to turn them into a box. And I want to create a 16-inch wide by 9 inches deep box with a waterfall mitered edges, which basically means that the grain runs all the way around. So to do so, I cut them on my 45-degree miter sled on my table saw. And I basically cut a 16-inch wide piece with 2 miters either side, then a 9-inch wide piece with 2 miters inside, and again 16 and then 9. So now I've got 2 drawer boxes ready for a couple of drawers. I haven't glued it together just yet. I've just taped it so I can see that it's all aligned correctly and it all looks good. I wanted to add some dominoes in each of the corners to help with alignment. And I also want to router in this wireless phone charger in on the underside. So once I've figured out the position of where I want it to be, the actual installation is pretty simple. So I got this one from Richelieu, which I'll tag in the description down below if anyone's interested. And I got a hole saw bit the same size as the actual charger part, and then made a hole in a piece of plywood, and I'm going to use that as my template. I then clamped my template to the underside of the drawer boxes where I want the wireless charger to be positioned, and then installed a mortise and bit in my router, set the max depth on my router to be about a 16-inch shy of the thickness of my material. So as I'm using 3/4 of an inch material here, I set my max depth on my router to 11/16 of an inch, leaving literally just 1/16 of an inch on top so the wireless charger can do its magic through that material. I don't know how it works, but it just does it. Anyway, then once that's set, I just remove the material 1/8 of an inch at a time. And then once all that's said and done, with this style of wireless charger, I can screw it into the underside and then tuck the wires out the back of the drawer and plug it in behind the headboard. And then no one would ever know unless you tell them. It's kind of cool. Actually, it's really cool, but. So now that the wireless charger is routed in on the underside of the top there, I also added a front rail to go along with my drawer face design. And I also added a French cleat on the back to help hang it to the headboard. So now all that's left is to glue and clamp these together and then let them dry. Meanwhile, while they're drying, I can make a start on the drawers themselves. And as the drawer boxes aren't that big, the height of my drawer is going to be about 4.5 inches. So with some of the off-cut plywood material that I had left over, I ripped a bunch of pieces down at 4.5 inches on my table saw. I then added a real thin strip of white oak to the top of each piece to hide the plywood core. I then cut each piece down to make a 12 by 14 inch box. I also cut a 1/4 inch dado to the underside of each piece to accept the bottom of each of the drawers. And with a 1/4 inch piece of white oak plywood, I then cut that to size to fit inside the dado. And then when all the pieces are put together, Together you have a very basic drawer box. So all I have to do now is brad nail and glue it together and let it dry. Now the drawers are made up, I can now attach them to the drawer boxes using these 12-inch drawer slides. I made sure to attach the drawer 1/4 of an inch away from the bottom and 7/8 of an inch away from the front to allow for a drawer face. I then, with the leftover 3/4 inch material, I cut 2 drawer faces, making sure there's a 1/16 inch of a gap between the 2 sides and the bottom. As well, while I'm cutting each drawer piece, I also put a 30-degree angle on top as well, which is going to act as the kind of drawer handle. I'm not going to have a handle on it per se. I wanted like that clean, minimal look. So it just gives you enough room to get your fingers in above and then kind of pull the drawer out. And I really like that look. Now my drawer faces are cut, I can now attach them to the drawer box by screwing them through the back of the drawer box into the back of the face. And then lastly, to the drawer boxes, I want to add this kind of receptacle extension thing, which basically plugs in the wall, and it's got like the power outlet and then the 2 different types of USBs. And it's got this like 16th of an inch lip, which I kind of want it to be flush with the top of the thing. I don't want that sticking up. So I'm going to do a similar thing to the wireless charger and create a jig the same size as the circumference of the outer ring on this. And then basically just set it up where I want the outlet to be, and then just plunge in like a 1/16 of an inch circle. Then I can bore out the center with a hole saw bit, attach it to the drawer box, and then tuck the wire in the slot provided for all the cables. And now the 2 drawer boxes are pretty much done. I can now put them on the headboard and kind of position them where I want them to sit. Then mark and cut out the whole slot for the electrical access, and then install the drawer boxes with the French cleat. So with this hole cut out, I can now take all the electrical cables in behind the headboard and then plug them into the wall, hidden from behind. So either side of the headboard, I wanted to add a shelf flush with the underside of the bed and flush to the outside of the drawer boxes. And I'm going to domino it to the bed but not glue it, so that way, in case someone in particular uses as a step, they're not going to snap it off, and so that I can take it apart. And I'm also going to use threaded inserts to attach it to the headboard for the same reason. And then finally, I'm going to cut like a million of these 5/8 of an inch wide slats out of the 3/4 material that we milled up earlier. And then each one of those slats are going to get glued into each one of the grooves, which we routed earlier on in the video. And with all of that done, I can now kind of happily say that I can start the painfully boring task of stripping it all back down, giving it a good finished sand, and then applying some Osmo oil as a finish, so that I can take it upstairs and get it installed.